Okay, so dito na tayo sa collection of physical evidence. Yeah, tama. So kahapon na-discuss natin yung iba't ibang physical evidence na pwede nating mahanap sa iba't ibang uri ng crime scene. So, now the question is how do we collect those physical evidence or pieces of evidence? The process of collection commences right after the crime scene has been thoroughly documented. Katulad ng paulit-ulit natin nasasabi na hindi mo pwedeng galawin, hindi mo pwedeng i-collect yung mga ebidensya hanggat hindi ito napipicturan, hanggat hindi ito na i-sketch pa, yung mga hanggat hindi pa siya well documented. Pero kapag well documented na siya, picturean na, nakapag-take down na ng notes, nakapag ah, sketch na, tsaka pa lang magpo-proceed sa collection of physical evidence. So, the collection process usually begins with the gathering of the most fragile or perishable evidence because they may be lost and can no longer be retrieved if they are not properly recognized and immediately collected and preserved. So, well, parang common sense lang din ito eh. Unahin mo yung madaling ma-disintegrate, madaling mawala, bago yung mga bagay na hindi naman nagbabago. For example, una kang magkokolekta ng, ah, for example una kang magkokolekta ng dugo kesa kolektahin mo yung mga solid na bagay. For example, eto, cellphone, mouse. Kung may pipiliin ka, alin ang mauuna? Siyempre yung biological evidence, yung dugo. Okay. Kasi nga, mag-iiba na yung kanyang itsura, mag-iiba na ang kanyang texture kapag mas tumagal pa. And there is a possibility that they may not be properly preserved kapag pinatagal pa. And then containers for collected physical evidence may range from paper containers, such as paper packet envelopes and paper bags. So non-breakable, leak-proof containers are appropriate for liquid items. Okay, so hindi mo ipa-plastic yellow yung dugo, yung laway, hindi mo ilalagay doon. So ilalagay mo sa mga non-breakable, leak-proof containers. Plastic bags can be used for suspected drugs, drugs of abuse, among others. Wet or moistened evidence must be collected and allowed to completely air dry before they are placed in paper bags. So for example, basang damit. So hahayaan mo muna siyang ma-air dry. Pag sinabing air dry, hindi mo siya uh, patutuyuin sa pamamagitan ng pagtapat ng electric fan sa kanya, pagtapat ng hair dryer sa kanya. So, hayaan mo lang siyang matuyo mag-isa, kaya nga siya air dry. Okay. And then, containers of arson evidence are usually placed in airtight, clean metal cans. So, kung gas yan, ilalagay mo siya sa metal cans. Okay. Each container must be properly labeled or marked for positive identification. The markings should include the evidence collector's initials, the date and time it was collected, the place where it was collected, a complete description of the collected evidence. So parang may caption ka doon, may description ka. The condition of the collected evidence, witness, and case number. All items of evidence must be separately packaged. The evidence container must be sealed before they are transported to the forensic science laboratory to prevent them from being tampered. Tampering includes alteration or contamination of evidence and switching of evidence. Yun yung mga involved or part ng tampering. Okay. So guidelines in the collection and preservation of physical evidence. So when you are collecting wet blood stain, liquid blood sample should be collected as a whole blood. It should be placed in a non-breakable, leak-proof containers and refrigerated as soon as possible. It should be immediately brought to the crime laboratory for examination since This is a biological evidence. Madali siyang mawala, madali siyang masira. Kung sa pagkain pa, madali siyang mapanis. Ganon. And then it can also be absorbed in a sterile cotton linen and allowed to air dry thoroughly at room temperature. Kaya yung ibang ginagamit nila cotton buds. This is done by hanging the wet blood-stained cotton linen in a secured place where there is sufficient ventilation. Huwag mong tatakpan ng electric fan kasi baka yung mga dumi-dumi sa electric fan kumapit doon. And then, how do you preserve it? Do not heat wet blood-stained material or expose it to bright sunlight to dry because it becomes useless for examination. And then, do not expose wet blood-stained material to an electric fan because trace evidence such as hair and fiber adhering to it may be dislodged. Ayun na nga, yung kasasabi ko lang. Huwag itatapat sa electric fan kasi baka yung mga dumi-dumi kumapit doon, matatamper yung evidence mo. Place the dried cotton linen with blood stain in a brown paper bag or box. Never use a plastic bag or container. Bakit? Kasi there's a possibility na mag-moist. Kapag wet blood stain ang pinag-uusapan, may possibility na mag-moist kapag nilagay mo siya sa plastic bag. Kaya ang gamit ay brown paper bag o kaya box. Package each item separately to prevent cross-contamination. Seal and label the paper bag or container and immediately submit to the forensic science laboratory. Wag kung merong, sabihin natin, 5 na damit na may wet blood stain, hindi mo sila pagsasama-samahin. Hanggat maaari, paghiwa-hiwalayin mo pa rin sila. Paano naman kung tuyo na, dried blood stain? So, small solid objects with wet blood stain should be placed in a paper bag or carton box, sealed and labeled before they are brought to the crime scene. Okay, pag maliit lang na solid object, kunin mo na siyang buo, kolektahin mo siyang buo. Kapag large solid objects naman with blood stain should be processed in a manner where the stained area is covered with a clean sheet of paper and the edges are secured with a plastic tape to prevent loss or contamination. Label the cover and transport it to the crime laboratory. If the large solid object is too bulky to be brought to the crime laboratory for examination, for example, merong blood stain sa isang aircon, dried blood stain sa aircon, hindi mo na kukunin yung buong aircon at dadalhin sa crime lab. Hindi. The blood stain can be scraped. Scrape mo na lang siya, alisin mo na siya mismo doon sa malaking object na yon. Using a clean scalpel or a sharp instrument into a clean piece of paper which can be folded into a paper packet and placed in an envelope. Yun na. Ang paper packet ay, well, isa siyang papel. Paper nga eh. Papel na may certain na pagtupi. Tapos doon mo ilalagay yung mga maliliit na bagay. Katulad nga niyan, dried blood stain. O kaya, what else? Buhok. So, ang gagawin mo, ilalagay mo sa paper packet, tapos ilalagay mo sa loob ng envelope yung paper packet na may ebidensya. And then, mark it. Scrape an unstained area adjacent to the blood-stained area into another clean piece of paper. Thus, will serve as a control. Okay. This can again be folded into a paper packet and placed in another envelope. Seal and mark the container and submit this to the laboratory together with a questioned blood sample. Clothing with blood stain should be wrapped in clean sheet of paper and placed in a brown paper bag or box. Mark and seal the container. How do you preserve it? Do not scrape dried blood stain directly into evidence envelope to prevent loss of evidence. Kaya nga, maglalagay ka muna o ilalagay mo muna siya sa paper packet bago yung paper packet ay ipasok doon sa envelope. Hindi yung ebidensya diretso sa envelope, hindi ganun. And then wash and dry the scalpel every time it is used to scrape another dried blood stain to prevent contamination. Do not mix dried blood stain. Place the collected stain from different locations in separate paper packets. Seal and mark each container for proper identification. Then never use a moistened cloth or paper in collecting dried blood stain from a solid object. Okay, DNA evidence, the deoxyribonucleic acid evidence. The following are biological samples with their recommended quantities that should be collected for DNA analysis. So, ito yung mga dapat na dami ng makolekta ninyo na ebidensya. Okay. So, for example, whole blood or blood stains, 1 to 2 ml or 1 gram. Kung ito naman ay saliva or buccal scrapings, 4 cotton buds. Semen or seminal stains or sperm cells, 3 swabs. Urine, at least 100 ml. Hair with follicles or root bulb. Yung sa buhok, pag binunot mo may root, di ba? Dapat kasama yon yung root. 2 to 5 pieces. Muscle, tissues, or cells, 1.5 milligrams each. Then bones and organ, 1 to 5 grams. Dried tissues, 100 grams. Ayun. Glassware and materials used in the collection of DNA samples should be sterile. Well, kahit saan naman. Hindi lang yan sa crime scene processing, di ba? Well, especially in schools, dapat talaga sterile yung mga ginagamit para ma-avoid ang contamination, magkalipatan ng mga virus, di ba? Same as with crime scene processing, hindi rin pwede na iisang scalpel lang ang gamit mo sa lahat ng pinaggagawa mo doon sa laboratory. Place liquid blood or tissues in spill-proof containers. Liquid blood samples collected from the crime scene must be refrigerated and immediately brought to the forensic science laboratory. Liquid blood should be collected with a sterilized syringe and pipette and transferred to a sterile test tube with ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid, EDTA, as preservative. It should be kept in the refrigerator prior to its submission to the DNA laboratory. And then blood mixed with water can be collected into a clean plastic container using a sterile syringe and frozen prior to submission to the forensic science laboratory. The different biological samples collected must be placed in separate containers, sealed and then labeled. Wet or damp blood-stained garment requires to be dried naturally before submission to the forensic science laboratory. Wet blood stain on movable objects found first be air-dried before they are sent to the forensic science laboratory for analysis. And then, still under DNA, each item should be placed in separate paper bags when thoroughly dried. Seal and label the container. Small movable objects with dried blood stain should be separately collected, labeled, packaged, and sealed prior to its submission to the DNA laboratory. So, katulad nung kanina, kapag maliit na bagay lang naman yan, kukunin mo na siya ng buo. Kunyari, ito lang, mouse lang. Mouse lang. So, hindi mo na siya dadalhin mo na rin siya sa laboratory. Ang mga bagay lang naman na too bulky or too big para bitbitin, yun lang naman yung mga pagkakataon, or mali, yun lang naman yung pieces of evidence or physical evidence na hindi mo na dadalhin sa laboratory. Kasi, what if, merong blood stain sa pader? Hindi mo naman pwedeng tibagin yung pader, di ba? So, kukuha ka lang ng sample mula doon sa pader. Hindi mo bibitbitin yung pader, okay? Pero kung maliliit nga lang, dalhin mo na yung buong gamit. Dried blood stain on big movable objects like carpets, upholstery, and the like can be collected by cutting a blood-stained portion with a sharp instrument. Ito yung napag-usapan natin kahapon, di ba? Yung example pa natin, paano kung yung buong bahay naka-carpet? Babaklasin mo. Hindi, di ba? Gugupit ka lang nung part na may dugo. Okay. And then, collect an unstained portion of the item to serve as the control. And then, dried blood stain on large immovable objects should be scraped off and placed in a clean paper packet. The packet is then placed in a paper envelope which is sealed and properly labeled prior to the immediate submission to the laboratory. So, ayun. I-scrape mo yung dried blood stain, katulad ng nabanggit na kanina, ilalagay sa paper packet, and then yung paper packet ilalagay sa envelope. How do you preserve DNA? Garments with wet blood stain must not be placed in a sealed, tight container. Hindi katulad kapag blood lang. Ito kasi blood stain. Kung blood lang, dapat siyang ilagay sa isang sealed, tight container. And then, do not handle DNA samples with bare hands. Baka kinamay mo. Kinamay mo, tsaka mo pinahid doon sa lagayan mo. Hindi. Mali yun, ah. And then, avoid long-term storage of tissues. Mapapanis. Then, do not mouth pipette any body fluid regardless of source. So, wag mo daw gagamitin yung pipette na pangkolekta mo ng ebidensya. Pangit naman nun, no? Ginamit mo muna, tsaka mo pinangkolekta ng ebidensya. And then, no ice should be added to the container. No ice should be added to the containing blood sample to cool it. Dry ice should never be used to cool the tube of blood. Avoid drying of wet stained garments under direct sunlight. Wag mong ibibilad, hindi yan labahan. Or exposing it to an electric fan. Huwag mong patutuyuin gamit yun. Air dry lang. Wet blood stained garments must be air dried. Then do not use plastic bag in the collection of blood and blood stain. In the event that there is no secured and well-ventilated place at the crime scene where it can be thoroughly air-dried, the wet blood-stained items can be temporarily placed, improperly labeled and sealed plastic containers and immediately hindi improperly, properly labeled and sealed plastic container. And immediately supported to a secured and well-ventilated place where it can be thoroughly air-dried prior to submission to the laboratory. However, under no circumstance should liquid blood sample or wet blood stain materials be sealed in plastic containers more than 2 hours to prevent the evidence from being destroyed by microorganisms. Okay.